Today, for this particular session four, I wanted to kind of talk about green space equity in yesterday's world and in today's world of COVID. And if we go to the next slide, I'm not sure if it's been set up, but I was hoping to do some polls. And the first question is to ask everyone, do you have access to nature or green space within a 10-minute walk? If you don't have the poll, let's just kind of make do with, hopefully everyone has had maybe the reactions on the bottom panel. So you can put a yes or a no. And I see a couple thumbs up, yeses. I see, okay. So far I see a lot of yeses. Okay, well, that's good to see. So next slide, please. Unfortunately, nearly half of us are not in that yes category. I actually went and looked up my very specific area, and it says I currently live in Silver Spring until October 31st, and I'll no longer be in this area. But it says that 95% of people where I live currently are within a 10-minute walk. And a lot of people, nearly half, are not like that. And this is based on scores from the Trust for Public Land. And here's an example of the top 10 cities, which is funny because 2 of them are like in my area. And then you see the top or the bottom 5 cities in terms of the scores. And these scores are based on access, the investment of the park, the amenities of the park, the acreage, and they just recently added in a component of this index to include equity. And so what we've seen is that over across the board, nearly half of Americans do not have it. But then when you look at it in terms of different demographics, you see even more disparities. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So we see that in neighborhoods that are the wealthiest, the widest, those are the neighborhoods that tend to have the best parks, the largest parks, the most well-kept parks. I saw this article that came out in USA Today in August of 2020, and it was a woman who was interviewed. She lives in South Chattanooga, Tennessee, and basically she lives in an apartment complex, and her park is right next door, but it's shoehorned to like a cellulose plant that actually processes used grease and lard into animal feed. So I can't even imagine what the noxious odors are. But in any case, it's a very small park. But only about 4 miles away, if you see the photo on the bottom, you see this very kind of palatial park. It has tree canopy. I mean, you can just see it. It's very nice looking. And this park is only 4 miles away on the other side of the Tennessee River. And so basically in the article, Riquetta was saying, you know, are we not supposed to be there to these other parks? Why there's more investment into these other parks that are so close by, but not in my neighborhood? And basically the difference is, one significant difference is where Riquetta lives. She lives in a neighborhood that's 95% African-American, but the Coolidge Park in the photo, it's bookended by predominantly white neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So in addition to the issues of access, you know, there's this whole ideal of privilege with nature. This quote, systemic racism doesn't stop at the park gates. I love this quote. It was stated by Dr. Carolyn Finney, who is a cultural geographer. And she's pretty much argued in work that she's done in her book, Black Bodies, White Faces, or White Faces. She's argued that, you know, the African-American presence in the great outdoors was removed by the racial bias in the Wilderness Act, and that there was just a general lack of attention for Black outdoor spaces. And then what we saw, thank you, white spaces. What we saw in the summer of 2020 was a perfect example of that with Christian Cooper, that incident highlighted the issues of structural racism and the exclusion and the white privilege, and how all of these intersect with nature connectedness and nature equity. Next slide, please. So same kind of situation. We can just use your thumbs up or thumbs down. This question is, do you know anyone who has personally died from COVID-19? I see one thumbs up, one thumbs down, 3 more yeses, another yes and no. So it's about, it seemed about half and half. Okay. And if we go to the next slide, please. The reason why that question brought up, partly because yes, this is part of the presentation, but I was, just as a side note, I was talking to a colleague, and this colleague is of European descent. And we were just talking, this is not way back, but it was like early in the pandemic, probably last August. Anyhow, we were talking, I was telling her how many people I had already lost because of COVID. And she was very surprised, not surprised, like, oh, not surprised, but like, really, like, you know, someone personally, that kind of surprise. And it just got me thinking, and I was like, well, as a person of color, it's just almost inevitable that I'm going to know someone or know someone who knows someone because of these disparities that we see. So if you look at this figure right here, which is this data from, it's data from the beginning of the pandemic to December of last year. And you see that basically in terms of age-adjusted COVID mortality rates for all folks of color, except for Asian folks, there was a 2 to 3 times higher rate of mortality in compared to white folks. And then if we go to the next slide, please. Now this data, it continues on from December until most recently March, kind of cut off because I won't get into the whole details of why, you know, we stopped collecting data based on race. But in any case, you see that some of the groups, there has been a slight attenuation, but in any case, the Pacific Islanders did go up in terms of the mortality rate, but all the other folks, there's a slight attenuation in terms of the mortality rates. But even still, there's still a disparity where we see that folks of color, again, with the exception of Asians, are nearly twice as likely to have died of COVID in comparison to white Americans. And then, next slide, please. This is data that I was able to obtain and put these graphs together as recent as this month. We see that there's still disparities. And we see that there's still disparities, you know, across race and ethnicity. I was also able to see whether or not there's disparities in terms of vaccination rate, which I already thought there was. But clearly you can see, with the exception again of white Americans and Asian Americans, that there's a higher proportion of folks who have a mortality rate in reference to the proportion of their population. And then these disparities are even more stark in certain pockets of the United States. So if we go to the next slide, you can see how it's even more disparate in like areas, for example, in the Washington, D.C. area, where you see that almost doubling in terms of the mortality rate of African Americans in comparison to the proportion of their population percentage. And obviously you can see that, you know, the vaccination rate is also disparate in terms of they exceed the rates of all the other groups except for African Americans. Okay, next slide, please. So this next poll question is, has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted your connection with nature? Again, we can do a yes, no, thumbs up. I was going to ask a little bit more detail, like has it impacted greatly? Yes. Impacted just a little bit? Yes. Or not at all. But you can just put thumbs up, thumbs down, yes or no, and we can just kind of go from there. So I see one, yes, it has. Yes. Oh, I'm seeing all yeses. Okay. So next slide, please. Pandemic, lockdown, and green space. I think during the height when we were all experiencing serious cabin fever, like I know I was experiencing cabin fever. Um, and can we go back? They basically, during the height in July of 2020, basically CDC was actually telling us, go out to your park. It's the safest way. It's the safest way to go out, get some fresh air, and go to the one closest to your home. Some people followed that. Actually, a lot of people followed that. But what happened was these parks got overcrowded. And you can see here in August 22 that this USA Today showing the parks were closed because there was just too many people, which goes to a little bit what I was talking about before. So I still say yes, only about half of us have, or a little bit more than half of us have a park within a 10-minute walk. But those percentages vary significantly by state income and other demographics. And when I say this is that parks that serve a majority of people of color are half as big, and they serve nearly 5 times as many people per acre. So if you're in certain areas, it's very easy for those parks to get crowded. And so we saw that there was a significant disparity of green space and park access at the height of the pandemic. And I think it really just kind of elucidated the fact that we already had these disparities, but we weren't really paying attention to them as much. But when we got cabin fever and we couldn't go anywhere else but green space, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait, what's going on? Next slide, please. So this whole ideal, we started to see it, other articles come out last July and last June about, this nature and equity. I've seen research which shown that, there's less tree canopy in areas that were redlined. And subsequently, those areas are much hotter. We saw a lot of that coming out when we were facing that heat kind of situation. I think that was late July, early August, when it was just a complete heat wave. And so we're seeing a lot of these inequities based on, or these nature gap in areas that are communities of color. And we do know that, I won't preach to the choir, that, there's an equity. I mean, there's a benefit to nature, but when there's a nature inequity, there subsequently will be health inequities as well. Next slide, please. And so going back to the whole idea of nature connection, many scholars, they've looked at health and wellness impacts to nature access. So, I'm going to keep emphasizing that. But the other key thing that some scholars have also emphasized is this nature connection, particularly among communities of color. And you've had researchers such as Kimberly Smith, who's a professor of political science. She's actually stated that the human relationship with nature is affected by the justice or injustice of their social surroundings. And I believe that in terms of currently and as well as historically. Other scholars have argued that slavery and other racial oppression has had a direct impact on African Americans' relationship and interaction with nature. And some of these policies have also impacted, not only our access, but our overall connection with nature. And again, speaking with, Carolyn Finney, she basically has emphasized this over and over in a lot of her research. Next slide, please. And so when we look at these images, in the absence of the signs, it looks like particularly this one in the lower left-hand corner, just all this grass. I just want to be a kid and roll in the grass, and just have fun. But we have to realize that despite the fact that how peaceful and beautiful these images, there was a very dark period that there was dark events that happened in these very spaces. Not that, these spaces were, spared that darkness, where a lot of lynchings happened, in open spaces, happened in parks, happened on waterways. And so we can't forget the darkness that occurred in many of the spaces like this or other natural areas throughout the United States. Next slide, please. And so my point is that we need to talk about it. We can't just kind of sweep it under the rug. If we talk about it, then we can begin to address the barriers to nature connection and access for folks of color. And I emphasize specifically African Americans, but this is something that is, for all BIPOC. in my opinion. And this legacy of institutionalized exclusion of these spaces from these recreational areas or just other green spaces in general. And due to the years of discrimination, for many people, the experience of being outdoors can feel like an effort, more and like a fear that needs to be conquered for its own sake, as opposed to just something that could just be tranquil and beautiful. And so too often people of color face kind of like either underwelcoming or over welcoming. And these are just also microaggressions. So you may have access, so you can go to these places, and I even experience these microaggressions. I'll have people who'll say like, oh, how did you hear about this park? And I'll look at them and I'll be like Rock Creek Park, like the national park? What do you mean, how did I hear about it? And so there's these slight microaggressions where it's a little over welcoming or under welcoming. And these are just things that just continue on and on. And so if we can talk about it, we can address it and we can start to remove some of these barriers. Next slide, please. So I believe you can't have one justice without the other. If you have green justice, you have racial justice, you have health justice. You can just keep going down, environmental justice. And I think when you have all of those together, then things will definitely be improved. And one of the small ways that I hope to achieve some of that is through the Nature RX that you had already heard about previously from our wonderful student, Sarah. And next slide, please. So I won't go into all of this, but basically our program is just basically, this way to celebrate our arboretum and the other recreational spaces that can heal and preserve human health and well-being. I have these folks listed here, but it really was under the kind of the steam and the engine of it was the steering committee, including Dr. Sachs and so many other folks on the campus who helped launch this program and who are still helping, who I hope will come to the meeting on Tuesday at 10:30 so that we can continue to do more work in progress. Next slide, please. So we have 4 main goals. I'm not going to go into detail to all of them, but I want to get to this last goal of recognition because this is a goal that I kind of added on. So when we have the meeting on Tuesday, folks will probably be like, hey, where did this goal come from? Because a lot of times we were talking about the prescriptions and the education and the research, which are still the 3 main arms of Nature RX. But this last one of Nature RX recognition is something that I wanted to add on because I wanted to make sure we acknowledge the land that the university sits on, the land that was taken from the Piscataway people. I want to also make sure we acknowledge the fact that the university had ties to slavery. And so all of this stuff, all the kind of the dirty laundry, I want to make sure that we kind of recognize it and then we pay tribute to people, pay tribute to our ancestors, and maybe there's other acts of atonement that we can do, but you can't think about that until we talk about it.